Hey friends, how's it going? Welcome to Changing Tracks. Today we have with us Sean Bailey. Sean, how's it going?
I'm doing fine, Christina.
Tell us a little bit, well, what we always ask. A little bit who you are, where you're from.
My name is Sean Bailey. I live in Roscommon in Ireland, although I'm from Dublin. And I'm a prison officer in a prison in Roscommon, or a correctional officer, as they call us in America.
Are you married? Do you have children?
I'm married to Michelle. I have two boys, Dara, who's 21, and Andrew, who's 13. And they both love going to Mass.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself. Were you raised in a Catholic family?
Baptised Catholic. Once I reached the age of about, I'd say 13 or 14, I stopped going to Mass. I couldn't see any point in going Sundays where I just get on the bus. In Dublin we had a bus service. It's not like Roscommon down the country. Dublin is like any big city, had a bus service that ran almost 24 hours a day. So Sunday mornings when it was supposed to be Mass time, I'd be on the bus and I'd be into town and I'd be just hanging out with other guys and, you know, going to the slot machines or the casinos, as they call them. They weren't really casinos as such, but just the gambling machines and just hanging around, I suppose. And that was pretty much, it was very strange. I always said the rosary. When I was younger, my father gave me a soldier's rosary. That's one of the rings with the 10 beads on it and the cross. And I always had it, I always kept it in my pocket. I'd never go out anywhere without it. And when I'd be on the bus going into town, I would always say the rosary. I didn't understand the rosary. I'd never heard of the mysteries of the rosary. But I would always just continuously say decades of the rosary while I was going in the bus, and then I'd say them when I was coming out. And I believe now that it was that, if you want to call it a devotion to the rosary, that ultimately saved my life.
You mentioned that when you were 13 years old, you stopped going to Mass. Why was that?
My dad would bring us to Mass, but when we got old enough to go by ourselves, I won't say he stopped going, but I never saw him going. So it didn't seem as though it was such an important thing. You know, my mum sang in the choir on Sundays in a neighbouring parish, and when we'd go to that Mass, it always, as a child, it always seemed so long and so uninteresting. I suppose just as a child you'd think that. But when we moved parish then, they built a church closer to us. And when we went into that church, my dad wasn't keen on the church. It was a very modern sort of church. My dad wasn't keen on it, and he just stopped going to Mass then. And I suppose it was just like through osmosis. If it wasn't important to him, it wasn't going to be important to me. And I knew my dad would, if he wasn't going to Mass, he wouldn't give out to me for not going to Mass, because he'd know in his heart and soul that he wasn't going. So I just drifted into it. My brothers didn't go and my sisters didn't go. I was from a family of six children, that is, and you know, we all just pretty much drifted away from it.
Can you explain a little bit what happened after that, or how did your life play out?
When I was about 22, 23, my life it didn't take a drastic turn or anything. I just got new friends. I changed jobs, got new friends. And I mean, none of them were heretics or bad people. They were good people who didn't go to Mass either. And we enjoyed our lives together. And my life, there was no time at any space in my life for God or for going to Mass. It just never dawned on me. But I would occasionally go into churches. If I went away with the lads, if I went away on holidays, if I went away anywhere, I would always try and find the church that was there, and I'd go in, not to Mass, but I would go in at some point during the day or over the weekend when I'd be away, and make some feeble effort to, I won't even say to pray, just to be there in the silence, I suppose, of the church. I always remember when I was younger, the silence in the church. I always remember the whispering, the people being very reverent, which I miss now as a returned Catholic. It's something I miss greatly, the lack of reverence in churches. But as time progressed then, my life just, sin no longer appeared like sin. You know, things that you spoke about when you were a child as being a mortal sin, or you know, that's a venial sin or that's a mortal sin. I remember when I was a child of only 8, 9, 10 years old, we used to sit on the wall, myself and my friends, and we'd discuss other people's behaviour and say, oh, that's a sin, you know, or that's a mortal sin, or you'll go to hell for that. But the concept of sin seemed to disappear from, maybe it was just a general thing in society, it disappeared from your vocabulary. And it seemed not to fit in conversations. So my life from that point, you know, going out drinking at night time and going dancing and going out with girls and just having a good time seemed like the most important thing in my life. And that was it. And then I met Michelle when I was about 23. Before I ever went out with my wife, I knew I was going to marry her. I remember saying to one of my friends, a lad I worked with at the time, Dave Ardell, his name is. And in a conversation with Dave, I disclosed how I fancied Michelle. And his response was, well, are you going to ask her out? And I says, well, you know, if I ask her out and she says yes, I'm going to marry her. So, and he was shocked at that. I knew then, and I know now, that we were made to be together. But even though we were made to be together, it didn't change my attitude towards this self-centered life that I lived. So it's although we were happy, we were as a couple, we were happy, we were going out and we were planning to get married. When I look back now, if I had given to Michelle then what she deserved as I give to her now, I mean, we're the happiest that we have ever been now. This 25 years married and 30 years almost since we got together, the past 10 years have been the happiest years of our life together. And that's a testimony to her courage and her faithfulness in sticking with me, I suppose.
And so you got married to her? Or was there some sort of change after you started dating her?
I lived a double life, you could say. You know, before I went out, before we got married, I would seek other women, you know. And again, when I look, I'm so deeply ashamed of how I lived my life. But it was just so shallow. Everything about me was so shallow and superficial. And when we got married, although for the early part of our marriage I was faithful, it didn't take long before I just returned to my old habits. And I couldn't see anything, you know, I'll say now I couldn't see anything wrong with it, but I knew in my heart, I knew it was totally wrong, totally sinful and totally disloyal and everything. So you know these things, by your nature, you know, nobody has to tell you. But it didn't stop me. It didn't change. And so when we moved to Roscommon, it was revealed through the circumstances of moving down that I'd been involved with someone else, and it absolutely nearly broke the family apart. And it was so difficult on Michelle, because we had just moved from Dublin. We're 100 miles away from Dublin. All her family are in Dublin, and I had taken her away from her family. And then before we had even settled into our house, my lifestyle is revealed to her, and it was just so devastating and so crushing. And Dara was only 2.5 or 3 years old at the time, so there was no talk at the time of us splitting up or anything. And it was just a very difficult time for Michelle. It was difficult for all. It was difficult for Dara, even though he was only an infant. And so when I look back, I set up my own business then. I started going straight, or cleaned up my act, or whatever you want to call it. And we set up our own business. It was going straight, although I had changed my ways. I hadn't gone to confession, you know, so the effects of the sin were still present in my soul. My soul was still absolutely in an awful state, and it has an effect on your physical being, and you cannot face the pain of how you have lived your life. You cannot face the reality of it, and so as a consequence, you do everything you can to fill every waking hour with some form of activity to drown out the noise. In actual fact, you're drowning out the silence. You can't tolerate the silence.
What happened after that? Did you continue in your married life, or?
We were grand then for a number of years, and then I hooked up again with this woman, and it was going on for a long time. It was going on for a number of years, and in the midst of all this, Mary Malloy, a friend of ours, she's heavily involved with Medjugorje, and she's a deeply faithful woman. Her son and my son went to school together, and they were in the same swimming club. And for someone who, talking about myself, for someone who had no time to go to Mass, I always loved talking about God. I always loved talking about religion. I worked in the Middle East for 6 years, and the Muslim guys and the Hindu guys, I worked in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and all over the Middle East. So I met loads of different religious and cultural people. And they couldn't understand, they always thought I was English, they couldn't understand why a white guy would talk about God. When we used to be on big jobs where it was involved in the oil field, so you'd be working through the night sometimes, and there'd be a lot of downtime where you were waiting for certain things to take place in the oil field. And you would be working with Muslim guys who would go into their prayer time. I was working with this Egyptian guy. He was an engineer, and after his prayer, I started asking him about Islam, and he couldn't believe my interest. And we just sat for hours and hours and hours talking about Islam. I was in an accident then at one stage when I was over there, and I ended up in hospital. And of course, all the nurses in the hospitals were male. And I used to sit up at night talking about God and their faith beliefs and my supposed understanding of God. But I was going to convert to Islam when I was over in the Middle East. And the only thing that stopped me was I wouldn't impose it on my family, because I knew the Muslim culture, the Islamic culture, that if the man was a Muslim, if the man in the house was a Muslim, then his family were Muslims as well. And I wouldn't impose that on my family. And I know I'm jumping back and forth here in my timeline, my storyline, but there was all, I know now that I was always seeking God, but I wanted God to fit how I understood him to be. I didn't realize that I had to change. I had to become who God wanted me to be, because God didn't want me to be the person I was. He wanted me to be a perfect person. He wanted me to be a whole person. He wanted me to be someone in whom he wanted me to be someone in whom he could live. In whom he could speak. That when I spoke, it wasn't me that was speaking, it was God that was speaking through me. And how could he do that? How could he do that with the way I was? He couldn't present himself through me, because it was just a sewer. It was just a distortion of everything that was human. It was, and not even on from a religious understanding or from a cultural understanding, but from a human understanding. I was everything that is abhorrent to someone calling themselves a man or human. I was everything but. So he wanted to be present in me, as he wants to be present in all of his creation. So I'll come back now to where I was. Mary Malloy, as I was saying, was heavily involved in Medjugorje, and I met her outside the swimming pool one day. She was collecting her son, I was collecting Dara, and she handed me a card. And on the card, I'm sure you've seen them, it had an image of our Blessed Mother, and just a simple line beside it that said, "If you knew how much I love you, you would cry for joy." And Mary handed me this card, and I looked at her while I was talking to her, and a lump came. I choked on it. I didn't want to show anything at the time, but it certainly, I understood what it meant. I understood what our Blessed Mother meant. So I kept that card with me constantly, and I would look at it constantly. And it was a few weeks after that then that Mary said, the 25th anniversary of Medjugorje. Mary's heavily involved in Medjugorje. So she had said to me, there's a conference coming up in the RDS. The RDS is a conference centre in Dublin. Royal Dublin Society is what it's called. And it's a place where people have conferences and shows and whatever. So Mary said the 25th anniversary of Medjugorje is coming up, and they're having a conference in the RDS. And she was asked to organise the stewards. She was involved in the organising committee, and she was asked to organise the stewards. And she asked me would I help her out. And because I was a prison officer and I had some understanding of crowd control or whatever her understanding was, it was completely different to what I thought it was going to be. So I said yeah, I'd help her out. And this was months before it ever came about. And as we got closer to the time, Mary was deep in work and trying to organise this, and I'd be going around to her all the time. Our families were close friends, I suppose, because the kids were in school together. So I'd spend time around in their house, and my understanding of what was happening was there was just going to be a load of people, and when I say a load of people, I mean maybe 20 people or whatever, sitting around the table talking about God. That's what I thought the conference would be. And while the organisation, it was being proceeding, I was thinking to myself, why would you need all these people? Like, why would I need to be there? You know, and if these people are going to be sitting around talking about God, what can they be talking about? You know what I mean? So it was proceeding anyway, and everything was moving along. And Vishka, one of the visionaries, was supposed to come over to Dublin and speak at the conference. So when she ended up pulling out on health grounds, and I thought, well, if she's gone, the whole thing will collapse. What's the point in having a conference about Medjugorje if one of the people from Medjugorje isn't going to be at it? But anyway, it went ahead. And coming up a couple of weeks beforehand, Mary said to me, she says, do you want to do the Saturday or the Sunday? I was on at the weekend, and I says, I'll do both days. I said, I'm off that weekend and we're going up to Dublin. And she says, well, you know you're not going to be paid for this. Are you sure you want to do 2 days? And I says, sure, Mary, you never know what'll happen. And never a truer word spoken in jest. I could never, ever have imagined, nor could Mary or my family have imagined what was going to come out of this conference. So I arrived at the conference. The night before the conference, I arrived at the preparation meeting in the hotel beforehand. And there's 20, 30, 40 of us there. I don't know how many people were there. And we're all the stewards and the helpers and whatever. So we were given our schedule of what was going to happen the next day. And I arrived, that was when I realised there was going to be 3,000 or 4,000 people at this conference. So, arrived the next day, and a good day, and met loads of really, really nice people, really friendly, really, you could see that all these people were so deep in their love for the faith, so deep in their love for God, that I almost felt like an intruder. I almost felt, you know, what am I doing here? But nevertheless, for the first time in my life, I acted humbly. And I made a point that whatever I was asked to do at this conference, whether it was mopping floors or helping someone who was ill or doing whatever they were going to ask me, I was going to do it. And I never questioned anything. And I was at the ticket desk. The stewards that were there were involved in the tickets and the ticket counters and all the stuff. So there was one of the girls on the ticket counter, and I was out talking to her. And she says, oh, Father Donald Calloway is talking at 1 o'clock. I think it was 1 o'clock, she said. Now, I can never remember whether this was the first day or the second day. But Father Donald Calloway is giving his testimony at 1 o'clock, and I says, oh, yeah, right. So she says, you know, are you going in to see him? And I says, you know, I don't know who this guy is. And she says, oh, he, you know, she was so excited, she was so animated about it. And I says, look, if you really want to go in and see him, I'll come out and cover the ticket desk. And you can go in and see him, and she said, are you sure? And I says, yeah. I said, it means nothing to me. I'd heard names being mentioned previously, you know, did you hear such and such a bishop or, and I hadn't heard any, because the names meant nothing to me. So the next 2 hours disappeared from my life. I have no idea what happened for the next 2 hours. I walked away from the girl at the ticket desk, and I went into the conference room. And the next thing, Father Donald Calloway is being introduced up to the ambo. Now, even though the 2 hours disappeared and I'd just been talking to her, when he was introduced as Father Donald Calloway, it never registered with me that this is the guy that she wanted to hear. So Father Donald comes out on the ambo, and he starts talking, and he's a Yank. And I thought, oh, I won't tell you what I thought, because it just wasn't nice. And I thought, oh, Yank, I cannot listen to this guy drawling on and on and on. And this is what I was thinking. Now, I'll go back slightly. The previous day, it must have been on the second day, Father Donald. But anyway, previously to Father Donald being introduced, or Father Donald, I think his name is Donald Calloway, there was a woman, Colleen, her name is, I can't think of her surname, but she was giving a talk with her husband, and she had been cured in Medjugorje, and her testimony was very moving and very emotional. And I'd gotten very tearful during it. And this was in my memory when Father Calloway was out giving his testimony, and I thought, well, if this guy, well, what happened was anyway, I'm not going to listen to this guy, I'm saying to myself, but after about 5 minutes I found I was still there. He had a lovely voice, he had a lovely accent, and he was quite funny. He was very humorous when he started off. So I went down the back of the room into the shadows, and I got a chair. And it was a regular conference chair like you'd see at a wedding or anything. And I said, now, if he says something, and I had the chair right beside me, if he says something that makes me cry, I'm either going to sit down and pretend I'm asleep, or I'll sit down and pretend I'm praying. But I'm not going to be crying in public.
Sean, hold on a sec. My dear friends, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. But we are left with a total cliffhanger to know what happens next. So I leave you all now in total suspense until the next program. Thank you. Thanks for being there.
And he started talking about St. Bernard, and he quoted St. Bernard, and he said, it is St. Bernard who said, it is the way by which a man has fallen is the way he will be saved. And she told me, I heard her in my heart. I would recognize her voice now, but I heard her. It is the pursuit of women that have led you to where you are, and it is only the pursuit of a woman that's going to save you. And I will take you to my son. And I said out loud, I says, Lord Jesus, I cannot go up to the bedroom and just wake Michelle and tell her, by the way, this is what I have to say. Lord Jesus, can you send your Holy Spirit to help me? And the moment I said it, Michelle got up out of bed.